Good evening, friends. It's Tom Swiss here with you once again to talk a little bit about Zen paganism. This week, as you know if you've been reading the blog, marks the 30th anniversary of The Sandman, Neil Gaiman's amazing graphic novel. It is actually not the 30th anniversary of the cover date. I think the cover date was January, let's see, 30 years ago. That would have been, let's see if I count on my fingers right. That would have been January 1989. But the um, first issue actually hit comic book store shelves in November of '88. I did not find the Sandman right away. It was a couple years after that. It would have been, I guess, 90. Yeah, 1990, maybe 1991. Um, some of you know my friend Joe, Joe G, Tinker Joe, Dancing Tree Joe, was my. We shared an apartment back in those days, and one day I looked on the shelf. Oh, what's this graphic novel? You got to understand, graphic novels were. They existed obviously, but it was the late '80s when they really came out there. You had uh, uh, The Dark Knight Returns. You had The Sandman. You had V for Vendetta, and when the field was really starting to break open here, um, and so read through Joe's copy. I was like, "Ooh, this is very interesting. I'm gonna have to start keeping up with this here," and yeah, I became a huge Neil Gaiman fan because what Gaiman does here, he really gives us a whole new take on gods and the relationship between gods and stories. Um, Through the pages of the Sandman, so many of the classical pantheons make appearances. Thor and Loki and Odin play roles in the stories here. So do Lucifer and a bunch of the angels and demons of Judeo-Christian mythology. You see some Egyptian deities, Anubis and Bast are characters here. One or two Shinto deities make an appearance. He gives us one of the few stories about Terminus, which I wrote about in the very first post on the Zen pagan here. Terminus, he who walks the boundaries, the only god to whom Jupiter must bow, because boundaries are the most important things. Oh, it's a wonderful story. Um, but besides all these great old favorites, Neil Gaiman gives us a brand new pantheon. There's the Sandman himself, Dream. Dream is one of the endless. The endless are not gods within the context of the Sandman here, but let's not get hung up on semantics. They are close enough to deities for our purposes. They are beings of greatly superhuman power and greatly superhuman responsibility, yet they have mostly human emotional and mental attributes. And these characters are known to us through epic stories. So, destiny, death, destruction, dream, desire, despair, and delirium. Delirium, who was once delight, and just right there, you get a whole story just in that phrase. Delirium, who was once delight. Wow, it's good stuff. It's good stuff. If you haven't read The Sandman, go read The Sandman, my friends. It was very very interesting because Gaiman has given us a whole new pantheon here. Let's think about this for a minute. How do deities come into being and come to be worshipped in a culture? Right? There's three possibilities. All right, we can have kind of the atheist point of view, which is that deities are created by a culture just the same way as works of art and literature and fiction are. Okay, Zeus was invented by the classical Greeks the same way that the Greek forms of drama and sculpture and poetry and all that stuff were. Okay, and so this is the atheist view. This is also the view, of course, of most scholars, most people, when it comes to cultures other than their own. Right? You could have a classic scholar who will tell you all about how the ancient Greeks invented Zeus, but he or she knows that when they go to church on Sunday, well, their God Jehovah is was is and always has been real, that completely independent of any human agency. Okay, so your second option is that deities, they're not invented like art and literature, but they do in some way come into being as a culture forms. There's some process of thought and attention that that is linked to the existence of a deity. It's kind of a common trope in fantasy, and I think some people think this, that deities are super beings. They're made of some supernatural substance, and their power, their existence, kind of rises and falls with the number of their worshippers. Right? That Zeus did not exist before the ancient Greeks, and somehow the ancient Greeks made him, but he is real, separate from them. Their intention, their thought, their attention created him in some way, or made him come from the possible into the real. Okay, so that could be true in a supernatural sense, or we can also take it from a naturalist sense, as I've talked about before, where we have to get into this kind of ontological anti-realist position where we have to ask some really hard questions about, well, what is a deity? What is it? What is a god, and what does it mean to exist? And go read my pagan go view my pagan atheist video from Starwood this year, where I talk about that if you want to think about that some more. Or we have the idea that, okay, no, deities are independent of humans. They existed before whatever culture worship them came around. So Zeus was hanging out on Olympus or in the Platonic realm or something. Every pantheon was somehow, in some fashion, existed before human beings came along. But human beings discovered them. At some point, some historical point, human beings discovered Zeus, right? They met. But in all three of these cases, stories are key. Okay, it's a process of storytelling that either invents the deities, or creates them by focusing our attention and our intention, or that spreads the discovery of deities. Stories make gods. And for each of the deities that we know about, from a pantheon, Dionysus or Kuan Yin, Jehovah, Eris, whoever, there had to be a time when this was just getting started. Whether the deity existed and was discovered, or whether the deity was invented out of whole cloth, right? There was a time when there was just one guy, maybe two, three guys who were doing this, just a handful of people. When there was just one person or two or three telling the stories. Now, if it stays that way, then this never becomes a deity, right? We just have a fictional character in the usual sense, however powerful they might be within the story. But when the story spreads and we all start telling the story, and then beyond that, when we all start making the stories, because we invoke these deities, we invoke these characters from the stories into our lives. So I wonder what's going to happen with death and dream and delirium in 50 years or 100 years or 500 years. Will we see that game in his pantheon take its place with people doing with people sending rituals about. There'd probably people already doing rituals out there, some pop culture magicians, I'm sure. But could it become a more widespread phenomenon in a culture? Will we see devotional followers of delirium? That would be I think I know some people who might follow this. Some days I might be one of them myself. Okay, so we might be really at the start of of a pantheon here. A pantheon that could become as genuine as any of the classic pantheons that we know throughout the world today. So look well, my friends. This is not something that you get to see every day. Uh, so that's my thought on the 30th anniversary of the Sandman. And whether you think that is ridiculous or whether you think that's a good idea, I really encourage you to go and read the books anyway because they are fan freaking tastic. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.